So tonight we're really happy to have a huge collection of amazing writers here, and to introduce them all is the man who collected their work in this book. So please welcome John Freeman.
There's like a lot of people backstage, and I don't know whether they're going to come out. Hi, thanks for coming. My name's John Freeman. I love tote bags. It's so nice to be at the Center for Fiction again, and I'm going to say some weird things because it seems odd to stand in this beautiful space with all this work and all these places where you can read with a book, and how we now finally have this kind of cathedral of writing in New York City. And I'm going to sit here and tell you that California is actually better. But it's kind of true. And maybe it's because there's 40 million people there. And it's just certain population numbers. 40 million people. That's a lot of talent that can be in one place. So maybe that's why 3 or 4 of the last 5 poet laureates have been Californians. And why maybe of the last 5 or 6 Pulitzer winners in fiction, half of them are from California, whether it's Viet Thanh Nguyen or Andy Sean Greer or Jennifer Egan, who's here tonight. You know, maybe it's because there's 40 million people in the state. That's why when something interesting is happening in a genre lately, it's been coming from California. Say, I don't know, maybe there's a new way to explain the way that men explain shit to you, and they call it mansplaining. Well, that comes from an essay from a Californian, Rebecca Solnit. Or maybe, there's a new way to write about gender and the fluidity of gender in the essay form. Oh, yeah, that's Maggie Nelson, Californian. Or maybe there's a new way to write about the history of race in the body and the way that a black woman's body has been seen through time. And oh, yeah, that's from Robin Cost Lewis, an LA poet. And if you run through all the genres, so much of the most exciting work right now is being produced by or in California. And it's not just the fact that it's 40 million people, it's who they are. Over half the state, over half of California are naturalized citizens. When 1820 came around and this place was opening in Manhattan, the people that were going to California and were going west were seeking their fortune. They were usually clearing other people out of the way who were already there. And so now I think we have this vision in our head of an old-timey California that is encapsulated by Joan Didion's line that California is where the horizon stopped. It's not where the horizon stops if you're coming from the south, or if California is to your east, which is how California is being built these days. 1/4 of the immigrants in the United States live in California. As well as this, the state is on fire 365 days a year. California has 60 separate individual lawsuits against the current president of the United States. So they're also doing that. But to me, one of the most exciting things is that California has writers like the people who are going to join me in about 30 seconds. Writers like Elaine Castillo, whose book America's Not the Heart is not just simply a kind of rewriting of what a queer novel can be. It claims the suburbs as the destination of a queer life rather than the place that you have to actually escape from. If you've read any fiction in the last decade or two, you've probably come across the fact that anything that you want to do has already been done by Jennifer Egan. Whether it's using a PowerPoint slide to write a short story in, or whether it's dealing with some of the ways that a woman's image can be used against her. And say a novel like Look at Me, which was a National Book Award finalist. I went uptown the other day, actually a couple months ago, and I heard Maggie Millner reading from one of her poems, and it was like time stopped. She doesn't have a book out yet, but if you read The New Yorker, she's been in there. If you read Ziziva, she's been in there, and she'll be on stage in just a second. Juliana Wang has a debut collection of short stories called Home Remedies, and she's written a beautiful piece for this issue about an avocado and what it means to come from China to California and have avocados delivered to you and eaten, and how magical a kind of fruit that was. So these writers are going to come out and they're going to talk to us about California. Catherine Barnett's here. She's going to maybe read a poem. She's the author of 3 books of beautiful, thoughtful, and funny poetry. And I hope at some point she'll just make us stop and listen to some of them. So this is why we're here, is just to hear just the variety of what is in California. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage right now. Here's my posse. So let's make it really easy because not everyone here knows everyone's bios. So starting with you, Jennifer, what's your California bona fides? Where are you from? How long do you live there?
Well, I moved to San Francisco when I was 7, and I lived there until I graduated from high school. So I was, they were very formative years. I hate to say it, but I really feel like a New Yorker, John. not to destroy your thesis, but for me, somehow, actually leaving California behind was a formative thing, and I really love being here. But I do love visiting, and it was, especially the period when I lived there, which was kind of the late 60s through the 70s. Were kind of fascinating years, partly because of what I had missed, which were the 60s, which seemed like a really bad luck and timing, and also because of what hadn't happened yet, which was the huge tech boom. So I feel like without realizing it, I caught a real pause in California's history, and so I'm glad that I witnessed that.
What about you, Elaine? Did you grow up in Milpitas? Were you born there?
I grew up in Milpitas. I wasn't born in Milpitas because there aren't really hospitals around Milpitas. So I was born somewhere in the peninsula in Mountain View, which now is obviously known as the home of Google. But I remember being able to go to Shoreline Theater and not feeling like you had to weave through the Google campus. I'm old enough to remember Mountain View before it was colonized by Google. And the same will happen to San Jose. So I grew up in California. I always sort of really felt myself to be Californian, and my dad was a security guard at a computer chip company. So this kind of the idea that the sort of preconceived the notion of California as this sort of tech center, I also sort of knew it as my family is working for essentially the kind of underclass that was allowing that sort of society that essentially that entire world to exist, really. But yeah, California donuts are better than New York donuts. Guys, I had Peter Pan donuts. Y'all are tripping. It's not. I need to go back.
I grew up in Sacramento, and there was an Air Force base near us, and they used to test jet engines almost once a week, and they would just sit there and fire these things at full thrust, nowhere to go, just to sort of make sure that they worked. And so you could vibrate a cup across the table counter. Did any of you grow up near? I know you're not a native Californian, but did any of you live near an Air Force base or a military base?
We were kind of near NASA. NASA, that's off 237. But it was kind of sort of not used. Now I think later we would think I think President Obama is landing there, or Sergey Brin is taking a private jet to the Caymans or something. But I think we always sort of thought that was the place where they made Alien or Terminator 2. I think it lived in this kind of science fiction imagination for us because we didn't know what was happening there. So it was just and then I actually had a brother who worked as a security guard there too. So yeah.
Catherine, you're Stanford, right?
Yeah, but I'm pretty much like Jennifer in that I went up when I was 6, we drove across the country, and I woke up and it was in California, totally baffled. But my parents had left all 5 children sleeping in the car, and they went into their friend's house and just left us to wake up in an utterly different light. It did take time to get across the country, but that was a baffling introduction. And then I stayed until high school, and I've gone back and forth a little bit. So I also, was there before the tech boom.
Where were you?
In Palo Alto, Stanford. Yeah, my father taught at Stanford. So it was they were all just cows and cow hills, really. We would go box sliding. So it was a very beautiful place to be, not with the kinds of wealth that it has now. And and not with the kind of pace that it has now.
Juliana, when did you arrive, and where?
Also 7. Immigrated when I was 7 from one of the coldest cities in China called Harbin, directly to LA. And I grew up in this place called the 626, which is like where all the middle class Asians hang. It's like this, it's the whole thing. And then I spent all of my life trying to leave California. Like I moved, to Beijing, to New York, and then I just really didn't want to be back there until suddenly now I moved back a year ago, and I'm just making everybody come with me. It seems amazing now.
What about you? What was your...
I lived in California. I lived in Monterey between college and grad school, and I was in this kind of strange marine biology and military town, and I was like an angsty young adult who spent a lot of time waiting tables and talking about natural wine. And I think similarly to Jennifer and Catherine, California was sort of where I realized I was a New Yorker. Sorry, we're like all just chiseling away at your introduction, but I felt like terribly out of context there, and felt all of this kind of existential dread that was me, and then I would leave the house and it would be like oceanic vistas and verdant landscapes and like giant tropical flowers, and I was like, well, you're not on my side. You don't get me at all.
But I should say, I still consider myself a Californian, even though I've been here so long. So I love New York, and pretty much the second I woke up in New York, I was happy. But I still say I'm a Californian. I still identify as Californian. And when I go back, they like, you used to be like a New Yorker. But I don't hear it. I still hear myself as Californian, and I still love the light out there. So I haven't quite transplanted myself. And I still am always 3 hours. Like if I'm supposed to be somewhere, that I'm still on the wrong time. I'm on West Coast time, so if I'm late, that's why.
I'm gonna use that.
But let's talk a little bit about this kind of California dream, because this is the topic of the panel, California dreaming. What does it mean? And I think the California dream is different now, especially when you look at who lives in California and who's making the dreams that California produces. And the fact that California looks like the future. It already is the future. Climate change has already arrived there, and it's already been disastrous. But also, it's no longer just a minority majority, which is a sort of oxymoronic term. When it's that it's now going to become a majority multiracial society as well. And so this California society, the place itself, the polity, is dealing with questions that our federal government right now is trying desperately to pretend it can ignore. And I wonder if that has some kind of impact on culture, on literary culture in particular. Because right now, to me, I look at so many writers that are publishing, and a lot of them who are interesting, even if they don't claim it, have some kind of California background. And I wonder if any one of you want to address that. Like, does that have an effect, what the state is and how it's in front of the national culture? Does that have an effect on what the genres can be?
Well, I like that line that you have in your introduction about talking about writing about California, but writing how to dream the life we're already living. I think that's probably. I think so many of us have these California is one of these places that lives very large in people's imagination, no matter where you're from. Like I lived in London for 8.5 years, and the minute you say you're from California, they're like Baywatch. Like beaches, they're like, a particular image of California is really exported to people, and it is one that occludes the lives that so many of us are living. Like I've told you this. Like I watch Beverly Hills 90210, and that is like science fiction to me. Mm-hmm. I grew up in towns like you're talking about, like majority minority towns where like over 60% of the population speak a language other than English, or was born not in the United States, or was a naturalized citizen or immigrant, and that was just America, But the idea that we have to bring into, these lives, these towns that have always existed, into the kind of collective imagination of what we think of California, or even what we think of America. You know, I think what's interesting now is that I think we're starting to dismantle this idea of California just as liberal enclave or California just as sort of tech boom place, but think of towns, hopefully towns like the ones that I grew up in, as also like American heartland. You know, that we can break away from this idea that middle America looks a particular way or exists in a particular region and doesn't exist in, you know, towns like these that say as much about America as anywhere else.
It is funny, though, the way California seems to embody a dream again and again, and there are different dreams. I mean, there was the gold rush, which brought all kinds of people out, you know, a lot of them, you know, to ruin and early death and all kinds of things, and then a very few to riches. And I feel like my family moved out as really part of the post-war California dream, which in a way was really the result of wartime industry, which thrived in California and in the West generally because there was just more space for it. So I feel like we sort of, you know, my stepfather was transferred in his job, and that's why we moved there. And, you know, there was an idea about being in California and what that would mean, and it didn't really work out. I mean, my mother and stepfather ended up getting divorced, and the kind of wildness of San Francisco in the 70s, my mother has actually said this recently. It was really a surprise to me that she thinks that their marriage actually might have survived if they had stayed in the Midwest, in Chicago, where they were both from. So, there was this idea of what it would be like to be in California. And I remember when we got to San Francisco, we would constantly eat crab. There was this, you know, we were so excited about going to Fisherman's Wharf and eating crab. And I feel like that's actually one of those things that tourists kind of do, but we did it for years. So and now obviously there's a whole different idea about, you know, tech and money and possibility, which, you know, no one, I think, except people who were already doing it then, really knew about at that time. So it is funny that it embodies that dream again and again. And I do wonder whether some of the physical beauty of it and the light, which I also remember. I remember the morning that I woke up in San Francisco and I looked out the window of the hotel where we were, and I immediately felt in this very deep way, I recognized that I was in a totally different world. So there is something about it that I think becomes the locus of these sorts of dreams of improvement of whatever sort.
Catherine, you were teaching Howl by Allen Ginsberg earlier this week, and so much of California's poetic, you know, sort of history was kind of focused on the beats for so long. And you can walk into City Lights, which is a good curator of that, but City Lights has been publishing Daisy Zamora and lots of literature and translation and lots of other poets, and yet, you know, that sort of group has grabbed so much attention. Do you think it's possible that California poetry is dreaming other dreams? It's just that we haven't really caught up to them? You know, like Wang has a beautiful poem in this, and Javier Zamora has another beautiful piece in here. And they're a different California that they're dreaming.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. I don't think there's a whole new school like the Beats, but I think because it is such a diverse place, there's all kinds of voices coming out. I do worry because the cost of living there is so outrageous. You know, maybe not in the more of the smaller towns, but the cities. You know, people are just priced out. But I do think that it is maybe a more inclusive. Like I grew up there. I didn't have all these ways of categorizing people. I didn't know the ways of categorizing people. Then I came east to school, and it was like in 3 seconds you were summed up. And it took me a long time to realize. Like I would go out in my bell bottom. I was just really all wrong out in the bell bottoms. I had no idea I'd wear the, you know, my little skimpy dress because it would be sunny out. I think, oh, it's going to be warm, and it would be freezing. But everything was. I think that at least the era I grew up, and I wonder if this is, I don't think it's true in the tech area, but there was a lot more freedom to be the self that you were. You weren't immediately put into a pigeonhole. And I don't know if part of that is out of that kind of beat mentality or the protests of the 60s and everything. But I wonder if it is a little bit of a more accommodating, or else just its vastness accommodates these new amazing voices, you know. I don't think there's another beat thing, though.
Well, there are also these Bay Area poetry movements that came after the beats, the San Francisco Renaissance and the new narrative movements, and so much Bay Area poetry for so long I think was like terribly exciting and strange and experimental and I think different from New York in that it often had a really kind of tangential relationship to commercial publishing. And I think, to speak to kind of both of your last questions, that kind of dream or that, I mean, I think I, as a young person and a young poet, had a kind of idealized idea about Bay Area poetry and then spent time in the Bay Area. And there are certainly still poets living in the East Bay, but there aren't that many of them, right? Because they actually can't afford to live in Berkeley and Oakland in the way that, you know, Robert Duncan and the Black Mountain School poets and all of these other generations of poets were able to kind of do and cobble together an alternative kind of literary lifestyle that I think, yeah, sort of in some ways maybe exists less robustly in those places.
I think there's a Stegner I mean, like Javier was part of the Stegner, and I think that has a long, illustrious history. I think they're gathering, you know, incredible voices. So that's also a center of writing right there. You know, where
He was also an instructor at the 826 drop-in English as a second language writing program. And so I love that he's in both of those. And to me, that seems like one of the futures of California right there, is that connection between the long-standing kind of illustrious program and then the program that's just working very close to a community. Juliana, I was remembering growing up in school, I moved to California at 10. I didn't read any Californians growing up except for Steinbeck, and we were dragging Steinbeck, Elaine and I, in a conversation, and I just realized that no one else, you know, Amy Tan was alive and publishing a lot when I was in high school. Nothing by her. The AIDS crisis was just kicking off. We didn't read Randy Schultz. You know, I lived in Sacramento. We didn't read Joan Didion, didn't read William Vollman. There was Chicano literature being published left, right, and center. None of that. And so I read in high school and grade school English people. You know, I read the Cavalier poets at Del Campo High School in Sacramento, which could have been more science fiction-y. You know, I read Gilgamesh, but I didn't read a Californian. And I'm curious, when you moved to 626 and you started going into school, did you read anything by Californians or anything by people that were living in LA?
You know, I read terribly because I read a lot of Danielle Steele.
California's best-selling writer.
Yeah. Danielle Steele, John Grisham, anything they sold at Costco, that's what I used to read. And I really, what Elaine said really resonated with me earlier about America becoming this kind of place worth a lot of immigrant voices and to see that as part of Americana. I think growing up in a place that was really diverse, I really did feel like I was just as comfortable as with, you know, tamales as like Korean, you know, having to go to the army construction stories. I feel like that was a very third culture experience, and until I left that city, I didn't really realize that that wasn't the rest of the world. And I don't think that made me, at that time, feel more American, or rather it made me feel like I was not a part of America. I think this, you know, to go back to what you were saying earlier, this is the place from where I write from. I think how I like to switch in between languages, how I think every character in a story should be comfortable with different languages, I think is because I grew up in that place, and it makes me think that, you know, the rest, American literature should look like this. But going back to what you just asked me, no, I did not read many Californian writers, but I did, you know, I read a lot of Murakami, only because I was looking for Asian people, like on the covers. That was really purely just to believe that I could be in the book, you know.
I was just in Frankfurt, and I was talking to, this comes out in Chinese, and the Chinese publisher, I was asking him, I said, so what's the best-selling book in China, literary novel? And he said, Norwegian Wood.
Yeah.
That it sold 8 million copies in the last, you know, whatever. And the second best-selling book was 100 Years of Solitude. that had sold 6 million copies in the last 10 years. Anyway, but as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that, we become writers and storytellers almost accidentally in some ways. And then gradually you start to want to be able to tell stories about where you're from. And, I'm curious, one thing that hasn't really come up is landscape to some degree. Mm-hmm. And California is so vast, and you can go from a desert to a mountain to a practical rainforest to the oldest trees in the country to no trees in almost no time at all. And Kathleen Alcott, who's a wonderful writer, isn't in the issue, but she's I wish she were, had this theory that basically Californians are different than the rest of all of us. Mm-hmm. I split myself in half there because they have a different sense of time because of that. Because landscape is time. A mountain is made by time. A river is made by time. And I'm curious if you could talk, I guess you, Jennifer, about this, because I sense in your work the welcoming of coming east, and of being here, and we've talked separately about what it was like living here in the 80s and 90s and living in Chelsea and working on your first books. But do you think that sense of time has created a sense of narrative space that's different than maybe other East Coast writers?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, the space in kind of the West generally in California is such a huge aspect of it. And as I said before, it really is why the tech boom is happening there. In a certain way, a lot of this is still a post-war phenomenon. But when I think about, of course, California is so large. I had barely ever been to Southern California, so I didn't really travel very much in the state. I knew San Francisco, and then we would, as a family, go to Mendocino, which I write about here, and so those were very rich landscapes that will always be with me. San Francisco is a very sensory place. The fog, the fog horns, the colors. And Mendocino is really old, beautiful forest. And so those landscapes, and it happens that for me, landscape is really, or sort of atmosphere, place is my entry point into fiction. So I'm very grateful for those settings and those sensations. But the one other thing I would say about the California landscape is it's a very long coast. And I think that's a really important thing too, because the waterfront and sort of ports generally have always been these very kind of liminal places. People who were, for example, merchant sailors were traditionally a very marginal population, and in certain ways very progressive. A lot of people who had proclivities or habits or pasts or criminal records that made it really hard for them to blend into mainstream society would be at sea. And so I feel like there's some of that is also really part of California, this sense of people coming from elsewhere. I think it's probably one reason that gay life was so robust in San Francisco and so kind of out, before it was in other places. And that was also a huge part of my teenage years because it was before AIDS was discovered. So San Francisco in the 70s was a place of great joy and kind of revelry in gay life. And I think the geography has a lot to do with that, actually.
Yeah, I sometimes I wish you would write a sequel to Manhattan Beach, which would be like...
I really would like to. If I can find my way back in, I would love to. I'd love to go back to the sort of tackle the 60s again from the standpoint of sort of looking at how the war led to all that happened in San Francisco at that time.
Have you read McTeague recently?
Not recently, but it's on my reread list very much.
Yeah, it's a bumpy ride because it has some of the things you want to know about sort of about San Francisco and the coast and sailors, but it also has all these other barnacles of dated material where you just think, okay, sorry, okay. Since we're talking about landscape and there's so many readers, I'm not going to ask everyone to read, but I'm wondering if maybe you can read your poem Monterey, because it has to do with so many of the things that Jenny's talking about right now, about landscape and the way it kind of seduces you and also kind of unravels you at the same time.
Totally. Should I just sit here and read it to all of these people?
Walk around them whilst reading it. That would be the.
Do a little dance?
We had a podium, but we ditched it because it just was
Okay.
sort of, yeah.
I'm just gonna adjust my posture. Okay. This poem is, it speaks, I think, very much to my ambivalence about, feeling a lot of kind of ugly feelings in a very beautiful place in this very, very kind of inspiring landscape. Monterey. Evenings, I would sit on a moldy, high-back couch and watch the light outside go mauve, then die. The neighbor's house was strewn with discs of mirror that turned in wind, blinding us when the sun was right, or throwing phantom orbs the cat would hunt across the wall. Those years were shapeless, unperfumed, a tincturing of salt and beaten air. Winter looked identical to summer, which gave the dim impression of a stilled planet, of a planet to which the worst had already happened. It was also a time when stars were back in fashion, not knowing their names or the physics of them, but using them for augury or just diagnosing personality traits. Many turned to stars because they felt jilted or unpersuaded by Western science, which had by that point made most other knowledge irretrievable. But some just said, it's fun, it's only fun, you don't have to believe in anything. I couldn't see the fun. Still, I startled when the chart said I was flirty and contrarian, obsessed by hair. Just that week, I had received a regrettable haircut, which energized in me a passion for hats. A helmet was a sort of hat, and I wore one every weekend when I bicycled to the abandoned military base, where bits of missile nosed out of the beach and ice plants splashed the dunes with rust and green, the colors of my fear. Ahead of me, between the bluffs, would tromp the man I loved, a stalk among sargassum, tacking west. Or else behind me, if I pedaled fast, or next to me, if talk or some dispute were underway. Our fights, I thought, were very rare, though he found them very frequent. It was a question of thresholds. Sometimes we would fight about how much we fought, facing each other in the little apartment we shared by the harbor, frothing up the atmosphere between us with our hands. During PMS, I'd say outlandish things. I feel like a spayed cat. I feel like a woman trapped in a painting that depicts her as a virgin, but she's not a virgin. She's not even a woman all the time. It was the West, its lassitude and gorse. It was the soft land ending as soon as I got used to it, and the light exhausted, spinning itself always into gold. This was just before the era of overt misinformation, or perhaps that era's undetected dawn, and for a while I suspected that the world was an invention of my mind. This made it difficult to advance at all across the world, or make the bed, or taste the fragile cod the wharfmen hawked. Looking out over the cliffs, the man would say the names of fish and succulents, the processes by which the beach had cleft itself so steeply from the crag. A tern flew by. The sun came through a slotted spoon of cloud. I've come to think that land was like my interest in my life, hidden for a time beneath a sheet of sand and dread. Then, gradually, I began to see it. I began to actually see it.
great poem. As you were reading it, I was thinking that one of the things, Elaine, I love so much about your novel is the way it deals with kind of entropy in the body and the kind of the way that the typical kind of so-called immigrant novel often is about arrival and not about redeparture. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that in the context of America's Not the Heart and the characters in it, because it feels like you're pushing back against this sort of sense that the destination is the most important thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think because when you think, well, I want to go back and talk about landscape because I think what both of you were saying was really interesting and really evocative about California landscape. But to answer this, I mean, I do think, we have a kind of notion of sort of immigration as a sort of closed loop trajectory that people sort of come and then my mom came in 1975. That was where the beginning of the story happened, and comes to California and builds a life in California. But it forgets this long history of Filipino American laborers who are working all up and down the West Coast during the Depression era, and essentially making farm labor and canning labor in Alaska and the West Coast and California, these sort of industries possible. And then, of course, that the Philippines was a colony of the United States, so that the idea of kind of American statecraft as we know it today is not possible without, Americans invented waterboarding in the Philippines at the turn of the century. The kind of idea that we have of America as a global empire is one that is written on these bodies. And we can't act surprised or have this kind of cultural amnesia when those bodies a few years later show up on our shores. So that idea of I guess pushing against that sort of sense of false beginnings, or that people sort of come up sui generis, or that people arrive in California for no reason without understanding that, well, America has been in us, in those people, in those communities, in those families for a long time, and that there are a lot of Californias that exist outside of California, and if you export those ideas of California, then you should expect maybe that something might be imported back. But I think the other idea about the landscape, which I think is so, I feel, who was I talking? I think I've been traveling up and down the East Coast a lot in the last month, and someone was telling me about, because I was making a very cliche, West Coast thing, where it's there's so many trees out here, in Baltimore and the South, and they were like, yeah, West Coast people say that a lot. And I think someone who was a geologist was like, well, the age of the land is literally different here. You're seeing a different age of the Earth here versus what you're seeing on the West Coast. And I think this is true for, certainly I'll speak for myself, but I think this is true for a lot of people of color and a lot of communities of color, that the idea of having a relationship with nature is something that doesn't always exist in your community. That's sort of, for me, I was like, okay, white people hike, that's a thing. People would ask me if I went to the beach, and I was like, I didn't go to the beach growing up, not only because Milpitas is sort of inland, but that type of leisure time, or that relationship to the land, or that relationship to California nature and its landscapes was something that felt entirely kind of outside of our kind of our community. And I feel like it was only later growing up that I was like, oh, I'm maybe middle class, I'm going to take a hike now. And you sort of say, I think I like sequoias. Or you go abroad and you develop a type of relationship to the land. But it takes this type of reclaiming, in a sense, especially if you're a first-gen kid, to be like, oh, this land, wow, I'm really going to quote Woody Guthrie, this land is also my land. I'm out. I think that's it. We need a guitar.
Yeah, well, Jenny, in your piece, you describe how you walk barefoot in part to claim the place that you're actually on. You're there, and there is something about California landscape that isn't about, I think, imperial claiming. It's just simply about its oddness. San Francisco is an odd city.
It is odd. It feels. It's on a peninsula, but it feels even more water saturated than that because of all the hills. That's really what makes it sort of an odd landscape. And so, the walking barefoot, I'm not going to lie, it really had a lot to do with thinking that, that's what hippies did and we're supposed to do. But somehow it made me feel connected to the place in a way that was really important to me. I sort of, looking back, I can't really believe I did it, but I know that I did. And it was, I think something about growing up for me was feeling like, because we moved to San Francisco, but we were my mother and stepfather had nothing to do with the counterculture. I mean, they thought it was strange, and they were. I feel like I saw it maybe sometimes through the window of a car, but we never marched. There was nothing like that. But other people had very different experiences. Like I went to high school with people who had gone, been to marches with their parents and all that. So we didn't have that, and I think somehow discovering that all of that was really interesting, and that if I had been older, I would have wanted to participate in that, was actually kind of an act of independence. And for sure, my mother was appalled by the barefootedness. So it was kind of a growing up, I guess, for me to feel like this is my relationship to this city. I experience it differently and very viscerally.
Juliana, you live part-time or sometime in Los Angeles now, and has your relationship to it changed from being there as a child and having it sort of given and presented to you by the fact of your move versus now the fact of your choice, to have lived there and to be living there? And did what Elaine say to you about, just now about landscape resonate with you?
Yeah, I think the first time I moved back to California against my will was for the Stegner program. And I didn't want to go. I had been living in New York, and I felt like that I belonged here, and I didn't, no part of me wanted to abandon the life I had here. But, there was something about that drive from LA to San Francisco, which I did at least once a month, and drive, and it was such a time of self-doubt and kind of the misery of trying to write a novel for the first time. And I feel so much of that was guided by these long drives up the coast and down the coast. And maybe there's something about how vast it is, how long it is, and how many houses on the hills that you think doesn't really matter, right? No one cares about what I do with my life. And it was very soothing.
Or are you thinking about that stretch of the I-5 corridor where you're driving for an hour through a pig farm?
Yeah, just driving and listening to audiobooks and looking at the trucks that are going by, and I'm just thinking, none of this matters. And and I think that changed my idea of California, because in San Francisco, that I went there and it was the tech boom, and it is still a tech boom. But all I got from that was that I was a writer, and sometimes I would go to a party and somebody would give me a 3D model of myself. That would be I'm like, oh, that's all the connection I had with this world. And and then moving away, this time actually moving back purposely, I think. Yeah, it feels like it's a land of enormous freedom. People are doing all sorts of weird stuff in different places, and I can be there.
One of the things I was trying to circle here a little bit is that storytelling is about space and who's in the space, and about movement within the space. And California, because of its dimensions, forces you to some degree to confront that. And one of my confusions moving to the East Coast is just not having a car. And, I mean, this sounds stupid, but everywhere you went, where I grew up, is that you basically had to have a car, and if you didn't, you were taking long bus trips. And cars they're deeply destructive to the environment. They're not particularly safe. It's one of the least safe ways to travel, and it's the mythology of the car. Rachel Kushner writes about this to some degree in her piece in The Issue. Is both stylized, and it's a stylized form of violence. And I wondered, Catherine, if you can read your poem, because it takes place in a car. It's one of the only things in the issue that takes place in a car, and it's not exactly a safe space.
No, I was thinking about cars, as that is as much my home as the landscape, because you had to go everywhere in a car when you were young. So I was 6. We would drive up and down, any little piece of road to practice driving way before we should have been anywhere near a car. I think it is a huge car culture, and I think that's also why it's a lonely place, because you're just in your car, and so there's a lot less. What I love about here is there's you bump up against all kinds of faces, whereas in California you're in your car. And my car happened to be, my father was usually driving, and he was he had grown up in Las Vegas and he had no concerns at all for safety. So I'll read this. And also Las Vegas, I was thinking a lot about Nevada, which borders California. There's something too about that. It was very lawless. There was no speed limit there. That was a part that crossing that border was a big part of how I understood California. So I'll just read this. Yeah, it's about my father. I don't have it memorized. I have some of her poems memorized. Ultimate California Highway 1 road trip. Yes, perhaps like yours now, my father is old. He looks at me through agate eyes with a layman's dread. I cut his meat for him, play some early stones, and ask him to read Frost because I don't want to pour him another Tanqueray. Back out of all this now, too much for us. Back when he could repair anything, it was as if he'd made us solely so we could stand there and hold the screws and listen to the Accutron humming on his wrist. We marveled that the watch didn't tick. You could see clear through to its insides. It would work, he told us, in any gravitational field. And we could see it glow even as we sped down Highway 1 at night when the cliffs dropped all no man fathomed to the Pacific. And we begged him, slow down. But the radio played on. Time, time, time is on my side. Yes, it is. And he sped up, said he was following the taillights just ahead of us, and that when they started to fall, he'd know it was a good idea to turn the other way.
I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I'll open up to questions from all of you who I suspect may have some. And one of my goals for this issue was to try to actually get away from dreaming, just to show people living their lives instead of sort of projecting their lives outwards or looking at an image and then sort of matching themselves up against it. And we sort of all talked about how our families have been there or gone away. Or you briefly described your tenure there. Does your family still live in California? Mm-hmm. And how have they fared, I guess, basically, in terms of, has it worked out for them in terms of what they wanted from the move?
It's difficult to say. I don't know how to speak to their happiness. But I think in many senses it fulfilled everything they wanted. It seemed that what they wanted was so little. Now that I think about it now as a person, and I think, I don't know. I find that this I really needed to write this piece about the avocado tree in my backyard because I think this avocado has been so representative of my parents, like my entire family's journey to the States and also what I do here now. And I don't know, I think maybe it's all wrapped together, right? Like, did it work out for them? Sure, I want to say that. Like, the tree is bearing fruit and, that the years have passed and everyone's still alive. But I don't know. I wonder what it would have been like if they made another decision, I think about that.
It is. Sometimes it does seem to me not the locus of a dream, but the sort of gateway to a multiverse. Mm-hmm. It's like it's this one possible other existence, and this is questions for anyone really. But one of the things that has me looking back to California now is just the fact that yes, it has an enormous homeless problem, and there are pockets that are not only conservative but rabidly. San Diego, for example, you've got some white nationalists in that area. So it's not by any stretch a kind of liberal fantasy, but it is trying to deal with some of the essential questions of, how to live collectively. At least it feels that way, and some of its political decisions. And being here, I mean, Elaine, you still live there, and you live there as well, but being here now, or being there, do you feel like that is a way that could possibly be an American solution? Or am I just simply trying to end on too much of an optimistic California's awesome note?
I mean, I have to believe that because I do live there. I have to believe that. I think I would. That's it. No. Will not elaborate. Yeah. I mean, I think for a while I was joking to my friends. I was like, if anyone's going to gentrify the Bay Area, it's going to be me. so I do. I think I do have some claim to it. But I think similar to what Juliana was saying. I think I think my answer to that could be to look at my own family. I think that, and I'm glad that you want to dismantle the idea of this California dream, American dream, because certainly my parents and my family had it to some extent, and then I think a lot of people who don't have institutional or structural safety behind them, all it takes is like one person to go to jail, which my family did, or one person to fuck up mortgage-wise during the 2008 financial crisis, which loads of my family did, which is why half of my family is now in Las Vegas, which I'm really glad you brought up, because I think Las Vegas is also this kind of secret exodus destination for a lot of people who essentially were either priced out or dreamed out of California. So I think to some extent, I look, having come back to California, I look at what is in front of me, or what is left of the kind of aspirational sort of middle-class dream that my parents had, and it is in tatters, absolutely. Like people's house, people are still deeply, deeply indebted. Are people going to have a future there? I don't know. But then at the same time, I think this probably speaks to what we were talking about, with a certain sort of wildness and weirdness to the ways in which our families or our people have sort of carved out lives there. Where I was like, but I think Californians are used to this also, this ultimate idea of post-apocalyptic daily life. Like all of us grew up with earthquake drills, right? All of us know end of the world, that's part and parcel of the landscape. So it's not necessarily about is there hope that we should then work toward? It's definitely no, still living. That I think is the Californian way of doing it.
Still here. You're still here, so I'm curious at this point if anyone has a question they'd like to ask of Jennifer, Egan, or Maggie, or Juliana, or Elaine, or Catherine, Hannah.
I guess this is sort of a question for everybody. First of all, thank you all for being here. This was really a fantastic event. But so I guess we've talked a lot about the kind of literary sensibilities of California, and I think that there is a sort of texture that I associate a lot with Didion, but there's a kind of sound and a musicality to the writing that is evocative of that mythology. And I was curious if you felt that while you're writing about California, if you're also drawing from sort of other mediums like film. I think that there's such a kind of aesthetic milieu of now Mike Mills' 20th Century Women, or Lady Bird, or even Mulholland Drive, but there's a way that California exists in the kind of artistic imagination beyond literature, and I was wondering, or music, or what your kind of California cultural touchstones are, and what has informed your writing?
I would say that growing up, I was very much music, and partly, again, obsession with the 60s, wishing I'd, been in the thick of it, and enjoying the music from that time, many of whose artists were still, very active. But also, and then the punk rock scene. So I kind of saw both of those things. And what was so interesting, the reason that in a way it was music, but it was also literary, is that, of course, this was the era of vinyl, and record albums were kind of like books in certain ways. They were big, they had pages, there was a lot of artwork, and so there was a very kind of overtly textual aspect to music production, and that had a huge impact on me. I would pore over these texts. And Tower Records was a place that I and my friends were all the time, and so I think that's my immediate thought about that. I didn't think I wanted to be a writer as I was growing up, but that sense of the connection between music and literary expression, I think, was formed and kind of fused for me in those early years?
I don't know if this is going to answer your question. First, I thought of mini golf. Like mini golf and bowling. Like I was that kind of person, everything was fake really, except when we would go into the hills and box slide down the hills, the hills were real. But then I was thinking about the body, and I often say to my students, because I didn't grow up, I came to poetry through journalism, and I wasn't schooled from the head down. And I think I got schooled from the body up. So I'm still reading with my body. I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but so my touchstones were really like sort of bad Americana, California mini golf. But I think it's really, there is a different feeling of the body there. I think it's a very erotic, there's an eros that is just more present when you move through space there. That here, because we're more crowded, I'm always been scared. Like I was scared of so much out there, but here, I was taught not to look at people, and you kind of hold your body like this, and I even don't hardly move my arms when I walk, and so I think the freedom of the body, but that could just be childhood, too.
So that's so funny, because I was thinking about that when I was thinking about the kind of music, because I was completely also, I think, would say California music in particular, kind of 90s West Coast hip-hop, California hip-hop was so sort of prevalent in the kind of ways I was thinking about how people speak and what people listen to in that certain area. And I remember, because so much of the book I wrote outside of California, and I would listen to the Far Side, also just because I wanted to listen, I created this like grand unifying theory. I was like, you can hear the weather in certain songs. Like I felt like you could hear the sunlight in certain Far Side songs, and I was like, in East Coast hip hop, you can hear that they're cold. Like you could just hear that. But I would go to it because I wanted to feel that kind of embodied sense of what space, what weather, what climate felt like, and I felt that came out in the art there, in the sound there.
The song California Dreaming was written in New York on a cold day.
It's cold.
Any other questions? Far in the very back.
So Elaine and I were sort of talking around this in the context of a Halloween costume, which I won't get into, but we were kind of talking about California regional history and the way that it's taught in public schools. And I remember something that I really noticed when I moved to the East Coast for college was the way that I learned about California history. It was A, much more in depth than the people that I knew who grew up in like the Philly suburbs and so on. And B, I got this sort of sense out of it that the land was really kind of soaked in blood and like full of opportunists, and we would just go on these like relentless trips to missions, and it really got sort of nailed into us, the history of the place that we grew up and the sort of uglier history of it. Whereas when I asked my friends from the East Coast, they'd be like, oh, the Liberty Bell, it's great. And I just wondered if any of you had that experience of like thinking of California as a much darker place than others did.
Hi there. Sorry. I mean, I'll answer because we were talking about like the Donner Party and growing up, like having to play Oregon Trail. Do people here had to play that computer game Oregon Trail? Was like, you will eat someone now, I guess, to survive. Like that is also sort of westward bound kind of history. Yeah, I think it's true that we grew up. This kind of relates to that apocalyptic sense of your own history that we had to build. Did you guys have to build missions?
We did.
In school?
That's so funny.
Yeah, did you have to build
San Juan Bautista? I can still tell you about it.
Yeah, and I remember thinking like, this is. Well, first remember thinking like, first of all, this is fucked up because they were definitely abusing Indians in this. And I think I like purposely made it like really rickety, and then I sort of like turned it and I was like, an earthquake has happened at this mission. And we're like, that's not historically accurate. But I think at 10, you're sort of understanding that you're like having a relationship with history that is fraught.
Anybody read that Frances Fitzgerald book about American history books? Classroom history books. She wrote it in the 80s, and it's as appalling as you would imagine about how American history is taught. And I think you sound like you went to a much better school than I did. Mm-hmm. So our English department was fantastic. You started with Gilgamesh, and you read all of Shakespeare's plays, and then at the end you had basically come out of Eton. Whereas our history, it was basically like a flip book. And so I didn't know about the Japanese internment until I went to an exhibit with my parents at a local museum. And so our history was really, really, really thin. And most of it was about the survivors and successful people. There was very little about kind of the basically theft of land and starvation. And I mean, I think it varies based on school. And California public schools, I think, because they're publicly funded and have been slowly chipped away by this kind of chipping away at collective public education, are all over the map. Like, you can end up with a really good school and a really bad school right next to each other. And since I've left my public high school, now I think 30 or 40% of the people there are on assisted lunches. The entire neighborhood has changed. All of the kind of Gilgamesh teaching English teachers have retired, and there's been, gunfights at the school. So the school has completely changed. And so I don't know. I think that kind of what you've described is might be particular to your school, but it might also be something that changes and can change very rapidly, depending on the realities of what it's like to actually teach. My school had 2,500 students in it. I mean, it was twice as big as my university that I went to.
Time for one more question.
Pre?
Hello. You might have addressed this already. Sorry, I came in like 10 minutes late. But I always think about, as somebody who's lived in both New York and California, like, there's so much in the middle. And I wonder how you guys grapple with that when you're writing about California. I feel like, and to John for making this a California issue, how are you kind of thinking about the middle or the elitism inherent, or maybe not inherent, whatever your thoughts are on it, of focusing on both sides? Like, we're here in New York and we're talking about California, but then given the political situation, there's all that stuff in between. What are your thoughts on that? How are you thinking about that?
Well, my family moved from Chicago, and that's really, the Midwest is where all of us were from. So I feel that so keenly. And I think one reason pardon? Oh, sorry. One reason in a certain way, I feel like California never quite gelled for us in certain ways, partly because we had this kind of long history in the Midwest, and I think our separation from, in my case, my father, and then the family that he went on to have, was made it harder. I feel like in a way there's something about the Midwest that actually feels a little more sort of like where I'm really from than California, even though California was very formative. So, and atmospherically, it's so different. I mean, there's such a huge industrial past. Chicago is very water saturated because of the lake, but the feeling and the history are so utterly different. So I feel that very profoundly. It's a very different kind of texture and history in our country.
And I think California, as sort of to echo something Elaine said, is we think of it often as having a kind of either totalizing kind of liberal haven identity or a kind of polar Hollywood versus kind of tech utopia identity. And really the majority of California exists in this really liminal, weird, strange, other place that is, I think, as politically and ideologically and culturally various as really all of the rest of the country. And those places are often sort of, just by the nature of Hollywood being Hollywood and New York Publishing being New York Publishing, those places are as overlooked, I think, as places like the Midwest, or of lots of places in Middle America, and are equally kind of strange and underrepresented and difficult to characterize.
Yeah, for sure. Dismantling that binary that they're sort of coastal elites and that they sort of live in that certain way. I mean, when we talk about sort of, obviously, often when we talk about sort of the anxiety around sort of like the voices of like the working class poor, it's always white working class, and it's sort of, well, the working class people of color in the communities like I grew up in are sort of immediately excluded because by and large they're California voters, which thanks to the Electoral College, I guess don't mean anything. So, I think rethinking this idea around the kind of, dismantling this idea that this overarching notion that we have that California exists in one way or that New York exists in one way, and understanding that we have middle Americas on the coast, and that those stories also need to be told.
That's a great place to end. It's such a pleasure to work with writers like Jennifer Egan, Maggie Millner, and Juliana Wang, Elaine Castillo, and Catherine Barnett. Their books are here, so if you've had enough California, their books are here, and they take place elsewhere. You've been a wonderful audience. I think they'll be willing to sign some of their books if you buy them. If you steal them, you're on your own.
Anyway, yeah.
Thank you to the Center for Fiction and to Melanie for having us, and to you for coming. Have a great night.